everybody. Welcome back to Reclaim You. Emily's here today, and we're talking all about health anxiety. Hey.
How's it going?
Good. How are you?
Good.
Good.
Excited to chat today.
Yeah. It's like really rainy and gross here.
I know. It's so gloomy. I feel like I just want to hibernate today.
I agree for the week because it's
Yeah.
going to be crappy all week long.
Yeah. I have my candle lit in the background and some string lights on. I'm trying to make it cozy in here today.
Oh, that's a great idea. I should light a candle.
Yeah, it's felt right. It felt right.
Anything to make it a little bit more
yeah,
cozy's a good word. Cozy and easy. And so Emily has a special interest in working with folks with health anxiety. And so we thought we'd do a little episode about it around what health anxiety is, how it might show up, some ways to navigate health anxiety and medical anxiety. I'm excited to talk about this and dive into it.
Yeah, me too. Me too.
Where do you want to start?
So let's talk about what it is.
Yeah.
I feel like there is a lot out there about it. And unfortunately, I feel like a lot of the stuff that I see is in a very almost joking kind of a presentation. Obviously, I get some of us cope with humor, so I get that. But it's a real thing and it's a real struggle. So I feel like with health anxiety, probably the first thing that comes to mind, I feel like we've all heard the term hypochondriac or hypochondria, which it shares some similarities, but I feel like there is a little bit of a stigma around that word. But essentially it is anxiety. So it shares symptoms with the anxiety that a lot of us are familiar with, but it's typically focused on health. So it is either symptoms are there, symptoms are not there. It can exist in both ways, but it's kind of a preoccupation with your health. And is something wrong? There's a lot of hypervigilance normally of feelings in your body. It might look like someone going to the doctor a lot or avoiding the doctor because they're really scared to go and get answers. A lot of times it involves researching. So I have this feeling, I don't know what it is. Let me try to look it up. I feel like that preoccupation is normally the biggest sign that there's probably some health anxiety going on.
Yeah. And when you're talking, I'm remembering the episode that I recorded with Rachel Shiflett about medical care and eating disorder recovery and how health anxiety can show up there too. I'm thinking particularly, for anyone struggling with an eating disorder, but particularly for people who are living in fat bodies or larger bodies who have felt the impact of weight stigma over the years in medical settings and how much anxiety can exist from just being afraid to show up and what will the doctor say and what will the doctor blame and how will they blame me, right? How will they shame me? And the avoidance of medical settings because of that, even if there might be, a medical condition going on that, a lot of people feel unseen and unheard and shamed just by going to the doctor. So that just popped into my brain. So I thought I'd say it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that reminds me as well, medical trauma can also play a big role in this. So a lot of times if there was something that happened, whether it was, something like an illness that was really severe or out of the blue, or, being gaslit by a doctor of oh, you're fine, nothing's wrong with you, or having something come up and having to go a long time without getting answers, those traumatic events can also lead to health and medical anxiety down the road.
Yeah, definitely. And I think even, anything that involves anesthesia would be interesting to kind of dive into some of the research about the medical trauma and survival responses that might be inhibited by anesthesia and how that can later manifest maybe as anxiety, but maybe that's an episode for another day. But all of the different traumatic experiences that people can have in medical settings or considering medical settings.
Absolutely. Yeah. So there's a lot of different factors that can play a role there. And sometimes we can't put our finger on it. Sometimes it's more of a, this is just something that I'm really scared of, and it gives me a lot of anxiety. And no matter what the source is, it's all valid, and it can take a really big toll on people.
Yeah, can you talk about that a little bit, about the toll that this can take on someone in the everyday, not only when thinking about medical stuff, but the carryover and the ripples that this might cause for folks?
Mm-hmm. What's coming to mind is it's a lot of times like rooted in things that we're feeling in our body that feel scary, but a lot of times are just very normal body things. And we can't get away from our body. Like it's with us all the time. So it's like we have these very scary, what are perceived as like very scary feelings, but it's not like a stressor where it's like, okay, like I can go somewhere else, I can get away from this. It's just kind of always there. So
Mhm.
I feel like it can really permeate all aspects of your day because you're just feeling it.
And it's like the more you feel it, the more hypervigilant you get. The more hypervigilant you get, the more you probably feel it. And it just
Yeah,
turns into like a
yeah,
jumbled mess.
yeah. And it's that stress response. So like our body is stressed, our body like perceives a threat. So we're activated, our nervous system's in fight or flight, we're fatigued, and all of that leads to more anxiety, which is exactly what you just said. It's that cycle of I feel something, so I'm anxious, and then I'm anxious, and that makes my body feel more pain or more on
Mhm.
edge, and then that makes me more anxious. It's a very hard cycle to get out of.
Yeah, for sure.
I think a lot of folks with that, that's when we tend to turn to Google. So I feel like a big part of this that we hear about when people talk about health anxiety is someone who's online on WebMD trying to find answers. And it makes sense that you want an answer in that
Mhm.
moment because it's scary, it's overwhelming. You just want to know. But then that starts a whole other cycle of the internet just being like, here's literally every single thing that it could be,
Mhm.
which just fuels that fear and then fuels the sensations in your body, which fuels the anxiety. It just kind of adds to the cycle.
Yeah, Google is a dangerous place in lots of
Sure
ways.
is. Sure is. And TikTok. TikTok
Yeah.
is full of medical anxiety videos that I think
Yeah.
are a lot of times, sometimes more hurtful than helpful.
So yeah, you know this. I'm not on TikTok, so I would imagine that mostly, mostly a lot of things on TikTok are dangerous.
hmm hmm Yeah, unfortunately.
Uh,
Unfortunately. I think there's, like with anything, there's a couple good accounts that can be used for resources and like to really normalize things. But I think the majority is just people who have like a very extreme experience or like out of the norm experience or misinformation making a video and spreading things that aren't helpful.
yeah, it's kind of like Reddit, like going on a
Mhm.
Reddit thread,
Oh my gosh,
and
yeah.
yeah, it can be really scary. In some ways, it can be validating in certain instances, and even like education, sure, it can be there around something that's helpful. Who knows?
Yeah.
But yeah, it can be like that confirmation bias, right? If you're hypervigilant and you're looking for something, you're
Mhm.
certainly going to find it on Google or on Reddit
Right.
or on Twitter or whatever.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And that
Yeah.
can go for like mental health, not just,
Oh yeah.
like medical.
Oh, that was a huge thing on TikTok of people were diagnosing themselves with like personality disorders, and
Hmm.
mental health professionals were seeing this and being like, whoa, like
Hmm.
this is not something that we take lightly. Like we don't want to just
Hmm.
throw out like, oh, I have this symptom, therefore
Hmm.
this is my diagnosis, because so many things can overlap. Same with
Hmm.
physical health. Like just because you have one symptom doesn't mean this is automatically what I have. So it's important to, if you have a concern, that's valid, but definitely take that to a professional.
So, what are some ways to navigate medical anxiety?
So I think the first step is to validate what it is. So if you find that you're kind of fixating on physical health or worries about health, if you're noticing kind of the classic anxiety symptoms. So that might be trouble sleeping, irritability, just like that nervous feeling, like GI upset, things like
Mhm.
that. The list goes on and on. If you're noticing those two things together, bringing up with like your doctor or your therapist, just the question of is this what could be going on?
Mhm.
So I think the first step can be to just get an answer of like, okay, like this is what this is. This isn't in my head. Like this is a valid concern, and it's something that I can work on. So with that
Definitely.
being said, I think some things that can help, going back to the Google conversation, that's
Yep.
that's always my first question and my first recommendation. And I know that it's really, really hard, but a lot of us with health anxiety spend a lot of time on Google,
Uh-huh.
and it's just going to make things worse. So
Mhm.
I think first and foremost, we have to either cut out or work on cutting down trying to look for answers ourselves, because
Mhm.
we're going to find way too much information. It's gonna just stir those fears up, and it's just going to keep the cycle going. But first and foremost, we got to step away from Dr. Google.
Mhm.
And similarly, like you were saying, like the Reddit threads, like the TikTok accounts, the even like the online support groups, like I think that those especially can be a little bit tricky, because they're created in a way to be like helpful and have a place for people to go to relate to people in a similar situation, to get resources. And I think that it can be too easy to read someone's experience and be like, oh, like if that was this person's experience with this, then it's going to be mine. And that's not true. Everyone
Mhm.
experiences things differently. But I think, again, it's like people who are maybe in like the worst case scenario group are posting these things. And then it's like, oh my gosh, like that's going to be me. When
Yeah.
in reality, like we don't know that.
And along with that, I was just thinking of it was when I was super pregnant with my son, and HuffPost this will connect, I promise. HuffPost kept posting stuff about, like infant loss and all of those
Oh
things.
my
Well,
gosh. Yeah.
important to be informed. It was like way too much for my nervous system at the
Yeah.
time. I was a disaster, right? And so I had to unfollow HuffPost, but also something to remember. This is why it connects. What you're Googling and what you're searching for on TikTok, the algorithm gets you.
Yes.
Right. The
Mhm.
algorithm, like all the tracking, all the cookies, it's all connected in the internet. And so the algorithm gets you, and it's just going to feed you more content that
Mhm.
connects to probably whatever test it is that you're looking up on Google, or the keywords, right? Like you're just going to get spoon fed more and more content,
Mhm.
which just increases the hypervigilance, just like what you were saying. So that like avoiding Google and like stepping away from Google does feel so important, not in just the searching thing, but in
Yeah.
all modes of social media.
Mhm. Absolutely. That's a really good point. Absolutely. Especially with TikTok, and I feel like those of us that even Instagram, like those of us
Instagram,
that
yeah.
have that it's like you see one video that you interact with, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, like I guess my feed is filled with this now.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's a good thing, like if it's like cute animal videos or
Sure.
like,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
something that you're into. But if it's something that scares you, then all of a
Mhm.
sudden it's like I can't get away from this even more.
Yeah. Yeah. Like it's in my head, it's in my body, and it's on my screen.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah,
Hmm.
so we gotta really try to avoid that as much as possible. If you're already kind of sucked into that, like on following pages, trying to do things to like reset the algorithm, which I know
Oh,
is
it's
very hard.
hard. I try to reset my algorithm all the time,
No, I
all
know.
the time,
Yeah, yeah,
and
but
it doesn't work. But
yeah, I know.
not to be discouraging, but
Yeah,
oh man,
unfollowing is a good
unfollowing.
first step. Like if
It
you're
is.
following accounts that are causing stress, like giving you more things to worry about,
Yeah.
like is that worth it?
And it used to be on Instagram, it was just the explore page.
I know.
Now everything randomly just shows up in your scroll, right? Like
Yeah, I
it's a
know.
whole different landscape. I used
Yeah,
to say just like avoid the
yeah,
whatever page,
Yeah.
I just named it. What is it called? The discovery
Oh,
page?
the For You page?
Yeah, that one.
Yeah.
Yeah. I used to say just like avoid that one, but now
Yeah,
you can't. It just shows up in the
I
scroll.
know. I know. Yeah.
Anyway, the
Uh,
cookies, the algorithm is following you wherever you go on the internet.
I know.
So I think we all know that by
It
now, but
sure
it's
is.
important to name
Yeah.
nonetheless.
Yes, absolutely.
Mhm.
Absolutely. I think another thing that can be really helpful is to get a care team set up that you really trust and who validate you, who listen to you, who are thorough and don't make you feel bad. I think
Mhm.
unfortunately there are a lot of practitioners out there that don't always take, they might see someone who is medically anxious and be like, it's just anxiety, or make them feel shame. And that just makes everything worse because
Yeah.
it's like, okay, like now do I need a second opinion? It makes you doubt yourself. It might make you go to the doctor more to try to get an answer, or like avoid more because you were shut down. So I do think another thing that is very, very helpful for someone who might have medical anxiety or like medical trauma, whatever it may be, to make sure that you have a care team in place that you really trust, that can help you navigate this.
Yeah, and it can be really hard, I think, to find, which is unfortunate, right? Find
Mhm.
solid practitioners and clinicians that will really hear you. And it
Mhm.
feels important to like interview people if you
Yeah,
can,
yeah.
right? To ask people if they're
Mhm.
trauma informed, to
Mhm.
really get a feel for how they treat and how they respect their patients and
Yeah.
the folks in their community, because
Mhm.
that can be game changing, right?
Mhm.
Having a safe place to go to.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And advocating for yourself. Like in
Mhm.
that interview, let them know like this health or medical things do give me anxiety. So can you please be mindful of X, Y, and Z? Sometimes that's like, can you be mindful of, not overloading me with information? Sometimes that can be helpful in like how doctors go over test results, like things
Mhm.
that might spur extra anxiety. And I think that that can also be a good indicator. Like if they respond really compassionately to that, it's probably going to be a good fit compared to someone who might just kind of like blow that off or laugh it off or like whatever it may be.
Yeah, and that like human to human connection instead of the doctor just like
Mhm.
back turned to you typing away on the computer. Someone was
Mhm.
sharing yesterday how like they didn't even look. The doctor didn't
Oh
even look at them the
my
entire
God.
appointment. And I'm like, that's that's not it. That's not
No,
it. No, this is your body. Yeah.
yeah. So someone that spends the time, who gives you eye contact, who doesn't make you feel rushed and or like you're asking too many questions or things like that are all going to be important things that you want in your care team.
I'm probably asking if you have other, members of a team involved in your care, whether
Mhm.
that's a therapist or a dietitian or, you know, I don't know, chiropractor, whoever it
Yeah,
is, if they have
literally
solid
anyone. Yeah.
recommendations. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think that's always very helpful to do your research if you can, just to get someone who you might already trust, like someone that they trust or have heard good things about, and make that process a little bit easier. Along those lines, and I think that this is something that is helpful to work on with a therapist or with a doctor that you trust, is learning how to get more in touch with your body and kind of learn a little bit more about what it's trying to tell us, because going back to that somatic piece of this, a lot of times when we are constantly on the lookout for something that might be going on, we become more sensitive to just like very normal sensations that are going on in our bodies, and it's perceived as a threat. So I think that it can be really, really helpful and necessary to do some work there to be like, okay, it's not always an alarm bell. Like, let me go inward. Let me see where I'm feeling this. Let me see if I can do something myself to maybe alleviate this, like if it's pain or tension or something like that. So like the deep breathing, the mindfulness, the yoga, the stretching. Like, is this something that I can help alleviate on my own? But I think that sometimes it's that fight or flight and it's like, oh my gosh, like something's wrong. Like I have to get an answer right now. And that I get that. It makes a lot of sense, but I think that it can just make us more anxious. So doing that piece to be able to go inward, to regulate so that we're not in that immediate survival mode is a really important piece of this work.
Because the fight or flight, right? That survival response will just lead to more tension.
Mhm.
And maybe it is something going on related to your physical health, who knows? But
Mhm.
being wound up in that fight or flight energy, it's going to be hard to untangle the chicken or the egg, like where one thing ends
Yeah.
and where another begins.
Yeah. I think it can be so empowering too if it is a way that anxiety is showing up in your body. Like if you're able to go in and help that yourself. So if
Mhm.
it's like, oh, I'm feeling pain, I was able to release that by stretching, or like I'm feeling tension, I was able to release that by breathing deeply. My heart was racing and that freaked me out, but I took some deep breaths and I felt it come down. If we're able to kind of label like, oh, this was anxiety and I helped this myself,
Mhm.
that that's hugely helpful and hugely empowering.
Yeah, and I think something that you've talked about in the past on previous episodes is like diffusing from thoughts, like
Mhm,
labeling something as a
mhm,
thought, as your anxiety, and just getting some space from it to be able
mhm.
to not be completely flooded by it,
Yeah,
because it's
yeah,
valid, right? I think that's important. Whatever anxiety, whatever worry, whatever fear, whatever the purpose of your anxiety is, it's valid. And
mhm,
also, like, can we get to know the story in the
mhm,
story? And
mhm.
by creating some distance between our thoughts and how they're landing in our bodies, I think we're better able to do that and try to figure out, like, what is the story here?
Yeah,
Like, how is this anxiety or worry? How is this
mhm,
functioning? Why isn't it functioning? What's it trying to
mhm,
tell me? And how can I
mhm,
start to do some work to be with that?
mhm. Which makes me think of parts where normally it's a part showing up that's
Mhm,
scared.
mhm,
And I think, down the line, like with a therapist, ideally, doing some work with that part of understanding why it's scared, but then also being able to step in and be like, I got you. Like
mhm.
I can take care of myself. Like I know when something's wrong, like I'm not going to ignore it. We don't always have to be on the lookout for these things.
Be the adult in charge in lots of
Mhm.
ways. And
Yeah,
oftentimes, folks who are struggling with this maybe didn't have an adult in charge to take
yeah.
care of these types of needs, who
Mhm.
knows whenever that
But
was.
but with the diffusion being said, I think the last little note I have here for something that I think can be helpful in managing medical anxiety is in those moments also having your tools that you can use to cope. So do you need to like get out of the situation? So I think sometimes it can be like this freeze situation of like, oh my gosh, I'm sitting here, I'm scared. Maybe like I really want to Google, like, do you need to put your phone down and get up and like go to a different room or like go for a little walk, like move your body, something like that to just reset? I think that that can be really helpful. Do you need to bring in another person just to be like, hey, I'm really struggling right now. Like, can you help distract me? Can you help hold me accountable to
Mhm,
maybe not try to find answers myself?
mhm,
Things like that, like finding those things that you can do in the moment when it feels really, really hard
mhm.
is obviously also very important.
Yeah. And when you said that, I just thought of that attunement and that co-regulation piece, that when a survival
Mhm,
response is kind of like activated, so if you're feeling whether it's frozen or like you have
mhm,
to, like, there's maybe some flight energy or something, like there's something
mhm,
churning, to have someone who feels super safe and grounded and able to just be with you in that, whether
mhm,
that's validating it, holding it, offering just this calm presence, and like I said, validation, really, that can go such a long way to just bring some
mhm,
exhale and some slowness to your system. And,
mhm,
maybe it is also someone reminding you that Google isn't
mhm,
going to be able to diagnose you, right? It will tell you lots of
mhm.
things. But yeah, that
Mhm.
external, having someone to be with you through it, to companion you through it, yeah, that can be
Mhm.
really, really game changing, whether that's a therapist or a friend or family
Yeah.
member or like your dog, right? Any of
Yeah.
those things.
Yeah. Absolutely. And other distractions too, like in those moments, whether it's by yourself with someone else. Do you want to listen to some music? Do you want to like watch your favorite show? Do you want to like color? Like anything to get your mind out of that very frozen, like hyper focused place in those moments, I think is helpful. So it's just finding what works for you. I
Anything else you want to add?
feel like those were the big ones.
Yeah,
Yeah.
some quick tips, and of course we could always talk more about these and expand, and maybe we will. But
Yeah.
yeah, just important to even normalize this, that physical health stuff, mental health stuff, right? It can be anxiety producing.
Mhm. Mhm. And I think it's gotten more prevalent in COVID times. We
Mhm.
all had a very large health threat and we had, the media kind of telling us very very scary, like big major things. So I feel like a lot of us, even if you didn't have that before, like a lot of people are coming out of kind of the worst of the pandemic, like maybe a little bit more mindful of their body, their health, kind of what's going
Mhm.
on. And that is valid. And again, we can work through it. It's not something that you're stuck with or that you have to just put up with.
That feels so important. I think that COVID was such a blur for me, just in the like season of life that I was in, that you're right, that hypervigilance around health and
Mhm.
safety. Oh my
Mhm.
gosh. And now the ripples of that are really
Oh, yeah.
real. That's such a good point.
Mhm. I mean, it was a literal global trauma that we all lived
Mhm.
through. And
Mhm.
I think that sometimes people don't give that enough credit, like whether it is health anxiety or just regular
Regular.
anxiety or social anxiety or depression, like
Mhm.
people are experiencing, I think, more mental health concerns since COVID. And it
Mhm.
makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, the isolation and just the fear, right? That under rumble of fear is really real. Yeah, the trauma
Mhm.
responses, and even connecting maybe to felt experiences that you didn't even know were there as a result
Yeah.
of being alone and isolated and afraid, and connections to complex trauma, right? Like there's so
Yeah.
much there. We should do an
Yeah.
episode all about that, actually.
We could.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for this.
Yeah, of course.
And yeah, we'll chat more about it on future episodes. I
Yeah.
appreciate it. Any
Yeah.
parting thoughts?
I think so.
Yeah, and everyone, we're taking a week off next week, but the following week we'll be back. Casey is picking up where we left off, a couple of questions we got about shame that we're going to answer in 2 weeks. So stay tuned. But yeah, until then.